right. Hi, everybody. I'm Max. I'm a first year student in NGP, and today I'm going to be interviewing Trevor McPherson.
Hey everyone, I'm Trevor. I work with Tim Gettner. I'm a fifth year student in the neuroscience program here at UCSD, and I work with birds.
Yeah, thanks. And so Tim just published a big paper in a big journal, and so I'm going to sit down with him today and ask a few questions about that process in grad school more generally and the process of doing science. So first, why don't we start with the paper? If you can give us like a high-level overview of what are the main ideas in the paper, and what was the question and what was the answer?
Yeah, so in the Gettner lab, we study auditory perception, and as you move through the world, you encounter scenarios where you're more or less certain about what you might hear. So we developed a paradigm that allows us to control two sources of information. First, the uncertainty of the sound that we presented to birds, and then we coupled that with a cue that allowed us to bias the expectations those birds had about what sound they were going to hear. So in this task, we have a bird.
And so the sort of question here is, how is it that the brain is able to combine these two sources of information?
Exactly. We have two sources of information: the uncertainty in the world, what the bird hears, and then the bird's sort of expectations about what it's going to hear. And we first ask, do these birds sort of solve this task in a way that integrates and uses both sources of information?
Yeah. Like it could be that the birds only use the immediate sensory world, which we know that they don't, but the exact way in which they use their memories or their...
They might just be responding to the certain or uncertain sounds that we present them, or they might just be relying on the cue. If we give them a cue that says, hey, most of the time you're going to hear left, they could just pick left every time or right every time and base their sort of behavioral decisions only on that cue. And so our first question is, do they sort of integrate those two pieces of information, the sort of uncertainty of the sound that we play them, or this sort of cue that biases them to, one decision or another?
And so what do you find?
We find that the birds use both sources of information in what's termed Bayesian integration. So this allows the birds to make use of the sort of uncertain acoustic sounds that we present them, as well as the acoustic cue that helps them decide whether, what they're really going to hear is in one category or another.
So you've got a cue, and you've also got some sort of sensory evidence. And in this case, it's, what is it again?
Yeah, let me go into the sort of task design, if you will. So we used naturalistic bird songs. Scientists will often present sort of arbitrary, very, tractable stimuli for their experiments, things we can control well, like sine tones or sort of gratings of different frequencies. But birds don't really care about sine tones. Birds care about chirps and whistles and the sort of sounds they make. So our experiment is designed to sort of meet them on their own terms and use stimuli that they're comfortable with, that they care about and will be more likely to attend to. This is also relevant because at some point later on in the experiment, we're going to look inside their brain in sort of auditory regions, and we want to be using sounds that these auditory regions care about. Birds don't care about sine tones, but they care about birdsong. So what we do is we take birdsong from two different sounds. We'll just call them sound A and sound B for now. And we use machine learning to generate a series of naturalistic interpolations between those sounds. Basically, an ambiguous mixture of A and B that still sounds like something a bird might produce. On a given trial, the bird has a choice between two sounds, sound A or sound B, which it learns to associate with left or right. There's an apparatus it interacts with, and it can go peck a hole associated with left or with right in order to make a decision. And so the birds go up to and initiate these trials, and then they hear a sound played at them. And that will be A, B, or one of the mixtures of A and B that I described in the middle. And so the bird has to decide, oh, this is clearly A, oh, this is clearly B, or ooh, here's an ambiguous sound in the middle, I'm pretty sure this is A. And it makes its decisions and is rewarded or said, hey, sorry, you didn't get it right, based on that.
Cool.
There's also, so that's how we sort of add the uncertainty of the stimulus into our paradigm. The bird has to choose between A, B, or some ambiguous mixture in the middle. Now, the second component we're introducing is a predictive cue. So this predictive cue is played right before the sound that the bird is supposed to classify. And this cue basically says, hey, you're 80% likely to hear sound A, or, oh, you're more likely to hear sound B. In this way, if the bird's paying attention and using the cue, it should be able to change its perception, bias its perception based on these expectations, allowing it to perform better and more correctly classify the ambiguous stimuli that are in the middle, the ones that are a mixture of A and B.
So the bird gets a cue, which is some indication that it's 80% likely. The cue might mean that it's 80% likely that the song will be an A song, or 20% likely, right? Like all these sorts of all the different.
Yeah, the bird learns over many trials that most of the time when it hears the cue to the left, it hears sound A, and most of the time when it hears the cue to the right, it hears sound B. So the expectations are set over multiple trials.
Right. Okay.
And the bird sort of learns this association, allowing it to leverage the cue and use those expectations to perform better at the task.
Got it. Okay. So, and again, this sort of question is, how is it that the bird is combining the prior information, like the cue, and the information about the song, right? And so, how do you get at that question?
Yeah, so we can measure the bird's behavior. We can see how they perform with or without the cue, and we find that the cue changes the behavior in a way we would expect. Birds are better at the task when you give them the cue, and their sort of decision point between A and B changes as a function of the cue. So this is consistent with what we call Bayesian integration, but the birds are basically just using both sources of information and integrating them optimally to, enhance their behavior.
Okay, so the birds are using the information from the cue to make a decision about which song it is.
They're listening to the sound that we present them, but they're also letting the expectations given by the cue bias how they make their decision, integrating both pieces of information.
Okay, and because this is neuroscience, we're interested in what the brain is doing.
Exactly.
So why don't you get into how you actually try to understand what it is, how the brain is combining these sources of information.
Absolutely. So as a first step, we have our behavioral paradigm, and we see that the birds are using both pieces of information and integrating them in order to optimize their behavior. The next thing we want to ask is, what's going on in the brain? So since we're studying auditory perception, we implanted these birds with high-density electrophysiology probes in sensory regions and recorded many neurons while these birds are awake and performing this task. Ultimately, what we want to determine is if these individual neurons, if they are sort of integrating both sources of information in the same way. This would correspond to, well, I guess I'll leave the Bayesian stuff out. We can maybe do another take where there's more detail if you want. But yeah, we want to look at these individual neurons and see if they're integrating both sources of information.
So, and by having some different firing pattern or different...
So these neurons will... So we're looking for neurons that respond differently to sound A and B, and also neurons that respond differently when we present the cue. So this would, if a neuron responded to all of those things, it would be modulated by both our sort of sensory evidence in addition to our cue or expectations. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at all of our individual neurons, and we're going to say which ones are modulated by acoustics. There could be neurons in the brain that are firing in response to something else, and so we look at the subset of neurons that change their firing rate in response to sound A and sound B. We're specifically looking for neurons that have a different pattern of firing for A and B.
You don't care about the neurons that are responding to any other thing, right? It's just
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're zeroing in on the acoustic-driven neurons that have different responses for sound A and sound B.
Okay. And so once you've got that group of neurons, how do you determine if they're integrating this information or not?
Well, first we want to look and see if there's any change in the firing pattern driven by the cue. So what we'll do is we'll look at the firing rate, or how many spikes that neuron fired on a given trial, and we'll say, is that firing rate changed for cued versus uncued trials? And when we add a cue, these neurons actually suppress their firing rate. So these neurons fire fewer spikes when there's a predictive cue.
These neurons fired these neurons which are modulated by the song and the prior, or
yeah. So we're asking when we present the cue if there's a change in response to the cue. That would indicate that the prior is also influencing.
Right. Okay. And among this group of neurons that you found responded differently, it turns out that their firing rate is decreased when the cue provides some evidence for which song it will be.
Yes, so we see that the firing rate decreases when a cue is added into the mix, indicating that these neurons not only respond to the sensory evidence, but are also modulated by the bird's expectations about what they're going to hear.
Is it surprising that they decrease?
Possibly. We don't have I don't know if there's like a great explanation for this. I think we would need to know more about what the neurons are individually coding for, what the population's doing, in order to really get a handle on what that decrease means. But there are theories out there, such as predictive coding, that hypothesize that neural activity represents an error signal or a difference between your expectations and what you actually perceive in the world. Yeah, that's like a whole other box of frogs to get into. But I think the decrease is surprising in the sense that maybe because the birds have a set of expectations, they don't have to expend as many resources or fire as many spikes in order to represent what they need to. So you could think about it from an efficiency perspective.
So it's more efficient to decrease the number of spikes.
Yeah, if you think of each spike as costing some amount of energy, then if I have a set of expectations, I don't have to work as hard to maybe represent the same thing.
That makes sense. Okay. And so you've got a bunch of neurons that seem to decrease their firing in response to this cue.
So to summarize so far, we have behavior that we know integrates both pieces of information. We have neurons that we know respond to both, or change their firing rate or pattern to both pieces of information. What we don't know is exactly how those neurons are changing their firing patterns. So what we want to do now is ask, how do these two pieces of information get integrated or reflected in the firing patterns of individual neurons?
Because they could integrate in many different ways, presumably, right?
Yeah, so we're looking in a sensory region, so we know that these neurons sort of represent the sounds we're presenting, and we want to say, how is that representation biased by the cue or the expectations that the bird has? You could imagine if the neurons were ultimately integrating both sources of information and representing the decision that the bird made, the neural responses would cluster in a way it would become more similar for sound A and for sound B, allowing the bird to sort of distinguish A and B clearly.
There would be less uncertainty, essentially, by the fact that they would cluster is another way of saying that, maybe.
That's a great way to think about it. The neural responses would cluster in a way that they are more certain or represent the categories A and B rather than the actual acoustics that the bird heard, ranging from A to B.
Right. Okay. And what did you find?
We actually found the opposite. So we found that neural responses didn't cluster, but they became more dissimilar when cued. The idea here is that we're representing the acoustic space with higher fidelity. We're sort of differentiating our neural responses so that they are more detailed. You could imagine these individual neurons as not actually performing the integration of these two pieces of evidence, but maybe attending to different parts of the acoustic space that'll enable another brain region or sort of the population of neurons to more easily create that categorical distinction.
I see. So in a sense, by having the responses be more different, you're allowing for the neurons to represent more things.
Yeah, we're that's a good way to think about it. It's like if someone calls your name and you turn and listen to them, you're going to be better able to parse what they're saying rather than if they don't have your attention. So in some sense, the expectations are changing the way sensory areas represent sounds, regulating maybe through attentional, we don't know, mechanisms, sort of the level of detail in different areas of that acoustic space. Areas where we think a sound is going to happen, we listen really closely to. We represent that information with as much detail as possible because we want to use that information to make our decisions.
Interesting. So where do you see this work going next?
Yeah, so another member of the Gettner Lab, J.C. Gorman, who's also a fifth year in the neuroscience program, she's returned to this data set and is analyzing it at a population level. So as opposed to looking at what individual neurons are doing and how they're sort of responding to these different levels of uncertainty, these different cues, what she's doing is she's taking a group of neurons and saying, how do these neurons coordinate their activity in order to represent the acoustics or respond to the cue? Ultimately, she's finding some interesting results that maybe point in a different direction. Ultimately, the jury's still out and it's early days on this sort of stuff, but we hope to find that that maybe populations of neurons are actually performing the integration that we didn't see at the single neuron level.
Right. To represent the final decision.
Yeah, we think that populations of neurons might, though individual neurons might not be representing the integration of these two information sources and the decision that the bird makes, we think that at a population level, the sort of covariant structure of the population might actually reflect these decisions. So.
Okay. Makes sense. Cool. A bit about how you got into what you're doing now.
Yeah, so this was the very first thing I worked on in the Gettner Lab.
Wow.
So I worked with a student who is now graduated, Tim Sandberg.
How did you decide to join the Gettner Lab?
It's actually a great question. I came to grad school not thinking I was going to be involved in animal work at all. I'm vegan, just for personal reasons, but I saw myself being very interested in computational neuroscience. And then had a really great conversation with Tim Gettner where I found we were interested in a lot of similar things. That led me to work with Tim Sandberg in the Gettner Lab. Tim Sandberg was just kicking off this project and learning how to do the sort of chronic electrophysiology experiments, and I basically got to sit in on those and help him along the way.
Wow.
So he really is the star of the show with this paper. This is his project that he sort of carried out from early grad school with the behavior to late grad school with the chronic electrophysiology, and I really was lucky to learn from him in sort of helping collect this data and assist with different analyses that we carried out throughout the whole publication cycle of this paper.
Cool. Do you think you can talk a little bit about sort of the research process and, were there moments where you thought this wasn't going to work, or did your hypothesis did your hypothesis change from beginning to end?
Yeah, I think we came into this project thinking that neural populations might be clearly I think we came into this project thinking that individual neurons might be performing this integration of two sources of information, and then we're maybe surprised to find that they weren't. And so we had to then, within the context of our sort of Bayesian theoretical framework, find a way to explain that. I think this is a paper that benefited a lot from the whole revision process, though it was long and grueling. You know, this is something that only got published this year. I'm in my 5th year of my PhD, and we were, you know, collecting the data 5 years ago. So Tim Steinberg and I have been working on the revisions and the rebuttal letters for this for a couple of years, and it's wonderful to finally see it out in press. I think the story became much tighter, and the reviewers all raised really good feedback as to, you know, different analyses we could do to better address things, extra experiments I carried out after Tim Steinberg had left in order to sort of round out this project. But ultimately, though it was a long fight, it was a good fight, and now we have a really cool publication that says something that I think is very interesting about what's going on, at least in the songbird brain.
Yeah. So you submitted, and then you got letters from the reviewers, and one of the asks was for more experiments, and you carried out all of these.
Yeah, I mean, this was a project that we originally submitted and was rejected from Nature and Neuroscience. And we got a lot of feedback in those rejections, and Tim Steinberg really did a heroic set of analyses, and I went and performed extra experiments, and we went back and repackaged everything and said, hey, you guys should take another look at this. We really addressed everything that you said. Give us another chance. And then that kind of kicked off our final, like, actual review process.
Did you preprint the paper before then?
Yeah, there's a preprint out. I think after we performed that, you know, the extra experiments and the extra analyses and the sort of clarification of the storyline and hypotheses, I think that's the version that the preprint exists as.
I guess I'm wondering because I'm thinking about the actual process of publication, and if it was more like we just want to put together this project that we've been working on and write it up, and then preprint it, and then we'll find a journal, or if you're thinking, you know, we want to write a paper for this journal.
Yeah, I think so. Tim really carried out this project in record time. I started working with him during my 3rd rotation in the spring, and then working with him, he and I collected a bunch of data over the course of fall and summer, and then throughout the course of the spring and summer, and then when we got to the fall, he basically fell off the earth. He, you know, stopped coming into lab and just put the blinders on, and basically in 2 months busted out this incredible analysis for ultimately what was his thesis in defense that was taking place that December. So he really hunkered down and kind of fleshed out what he wanted to be the sort of first draft of this story. And after that, he graduated and left, and we were working in this situation where he was starting a postdoc at Harvard, and I'm here, and we're both sort of on the back burner working on these analyses, sort of refining the story, digging into the data more. And so I think, you know, part of the long timeline might have been the fact that it was a very sort of decentralized effort between the two of us, where, you know, he's kind of learning how to, you know, where his place is going to be in this new lab, and I'm sort of moving in my own directions project-wise.
But, like, did you think, in terms of the publication, did you, how did you decide on Nature Neuro, I guess?
How did we decide on Nature Neuro? Well, I think we initially submitted to Nature, or maybe Science. We submitted to one of those, and then were rejected, and then wanted to, work our way down from there. We thought it was a very cool data set and publication. I think the scope, the number of birds that are included in this data set, and the number of trials, we have millions of trials over the course of this data set, collected over tens of birds. And so I think just from a sort of experimental effort perspective, it was a monumental achievement, what Tim Steinberg really pulled together. And in the initial reviews, that was sort of feedback we got. People were like, wow, this is crazy. This is a lot of data. You've collected an incredible data set. We're not exactly sure about the storyline or convinced of that. And so, you know, though it was a very rich sort of space to work in, it definitely took some iterations to figure out what's the best way to sort of tell or frame this story.
Cool. Okay. And has this project been the bulk of your work so far as a PhD?
No, this has really been like a side project that's just kind of carried on from my rotation. A lot of analyses in neuroscience focus on firing rates, or basically how many spikes a neuron fires at a given point in time, and use these firing rates to determine what is encoded in the population. A lot of work I'm doing is exploring a different and complementary analysis perspective that, rather looking at firing rates, looks at the combinatorial pattern of spiking across the population. Basically, what neurons fire at the same time and what neurons are silent at the same time. And these relative patterns of neural activity have the potential to encode information as well. And so I'm working with both data collected from songbirds as well as spiking neural networks to sort of model how this combinatorial code can capture relative differences that we see in the world around us. I know that's less
no, that's so
harder
fascinating. Yeah. But the idea here is that the code is not necessarily individual spikes, or rather the spike rate, but it is the which neurons fire together.
Yeah.
So you're studying these spiking neural networks, and the question is, I mean, for a long time, people have generally thought that the way neurons encode information is through the rate at which they're spiking, right?
Yeah, you could imagine I dial up the intensity of some stimulus and the neuron fires more and more. And so I think this sort of complementary analysis perspective looks across neurons and doesn't care about intensity. If I have different patterns of neurons, the distance between those patterns of neurons should reflect distances between stimuli in the outside world.
Okay.
So the idea is that a population of neurons, through this pattern of coactivation, is encoding relative differences.
So if neuron A, like it's some relative difference might be encoded through the fact that neuron A has a different firing rate with respect to neuron B.
Yeah.
Or firing pattern.
I think more about patterns than rates.
Because it could be an interval in time.
It could be an interval in time. I think about coactivity of neurons. So if neuron A and B fire at the same time, that maybe says something different than if A and C fire at the same time. Yeah.
Okay. I see. Okay. Cool. Like the Nature paper, and then also you're doing all of your other projects. How do you feel about is it a lot of work?
It is.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a lot of work, but it's also I also love it, and I think there is I think you definitely need to have a balance to grad school. I am someone who definitely worked really hard during my post-bac and burnt myself out multiple times and crashed and burned because I was so worried about getting into grad school. In a lot of ways that wasn't great. It was great in the sense that I feel like I know my limits really well, and I know when I'm starting to become unhappy if I'm working too much. And so I feel like I've got a really good barometer for my work-life balance, which lets me sort of be efficient and get the things that I need to get done. And throughout grad school, I've really learned to sort of lean into my intuition for what I should be working on at any given point in time. And so far, that's served me well. But absolutely, there's more to life than grad school.
What else is there?
What else is there? No, you gotta like cut the line off at some point. Go home at the end of the day and hang out with your cat.
Is that so? I was going to ask. In maintaining your work-life balance, what else do you like to do?
I've been really lucky to develop an awesome network of friends, who are many of which are grad students here at UCSD, which love them. They're always very supportive of me and spending time with them. I love San Diego as it's a place you can get outside. I love being outdoors.
Yeah.
I love going surfing. I'm going surfing tomorrow morning, so that's like a great way to start the day.
Yeah.
Start the day a bit later, but you feel great throughout it all.
That's awesome.
I love going to concerts and seeing live music. I was a music major in undergrad.
Oh, wow.
So that's like, music's always near and dear, whether I'm trying to make it with my friends or listen to some new artists. So
Or understand it in the brains of songbirds.
Or understand it in the brains of songbirds.
Yeah.
Actually, my first 2 publications were working with a music therapist.
Really?
Kind of examining rhythm in the context of, like behavior and music therapy interventions.
Oh,
So
cool. Wow.
that I had, I got to do like very fun interdisciplinary research to start things off.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. So thank you so much for talking.
Yeah,
Really appreciate everything you had to say. So
Awesome. Thank you
thanks.
for all the great questions and commentary.
Yeah, thanks.